If you've been watching my videos over this past year or so, you may have seen these inclusions of bronze I've been using, fragments of metal that up until now I've been wedging into my clay at random, leading to pots that are arbitrarily covered in red metallic dots, as the copper in the bronze melts and volatilizes during the firing, creating these small areas of copper red that melt and mix with the rest of the green glaze. Eventually, some of the bronze shards ended up in my reclaim, and a few months later I trimmed these bowls, simple angular vessels with tool feet, and I was completely unaware if there was any bronze inside them. I made two pieces like this, and both had a few specks of red scattered across them when I unpacked them from the kiln, but one of them did something slightly unexpected, and that was very simply having these two red dots line up, one on the outside of the rim and one on the inside, opposite each other. This isn't the first time I've had two dots line up. These two lidded jars are linked together, more so due to where these random dots of red appeared. And this all got me thinking, maybe I should be using these fragments of bronze more deliberately. I should be intentional with their placement, rather than simply mixing it into the clay at random, which tends to yield results such as this. And it also means there's a certain amount of bronze in my reclaim at any one point, whereas if I'm more intentional with their placement, then the metal will no longer contaminate my recycled clay. Anyhow, in this video, I'll be making a batch of bowls with bronze being purposefully inserted into them. This way it goes from being a random element in my work to more of a design-led choice, which for me is a bit more exciting as it opens up simple possibilities, such as lining the dots up to create some really simple surface decoration that gives the vessel face, direction, an obvious way to display them, look at them, and use them. This is the bronze I'll be using, scraps given to me by Alex Pohl, a blacksmith. You'd think that mixing these shards into the clay and throwing with it could be quite painful, but in reality, when wedged into a slightly grogged clay, you barely feel it. Yet, when it comes to trimming the pots, if there's lots of this mixed into the clay, the turning tool's blade constantly catches onto these and drags them across the surface, leaving these long gouges, which I've then got to tidy up, which is a slightly frustrating experience. So again, this is another issue I can negate, simply by inserting them into the walls of the pot after it's been trimmed. These are the 6 bowls I threw for this experiment, which are now the perfect state of leather hard to trim. I can test this by rubbing my finger across the bottom. If there's a smear in the wake of my finger, then the clay is slightly too soft to trim, like you can see on this left piece. Ideally, I want the clay body to be so firm that when I drag my finger across, even these lines don't smudge. And beyond that, you should be able to pick the pots up without them distorting, and they shouldn't feel wet or sticky or cold. They should, well, feel a bit like leather, hard to the touch, not sticky, not cold, and they should hold their shapes when picked up. If your trimming and the turnings simply come off and stick right back onto the pot you're working on, then your clay is still far too soft to be working with. When I place the pot down, if I notice the rim is wavering a bit like this, I'll flip it upside down, quickly tap center it, and I'll just turn a small portion of the base, leveling it. This usually involves trimming away more from one side than the other until it's flat. This will normally correct minor undulations in the lip of the pot. It doesn't always completely fix it, but sometimes it's a quick solution to fix any minor irregularities in the shape. I then attach the bowl to the metal wheel head by placing it on a thin layer of slip. The form is tap centered on this, and then I use the corner of a plastic kidney just to seal the clay against the wheel. I then lightly tidy up the interior surface if it needs it, but the main reason the bowl is attached to the wheel this way up is so I can turn the exterior shape and feel the cross section as I'm doing so. These bowls are thrown relatively thickly with a curved interior. This way I can trim the outside shape to be angular, whilst retaining the more functional curved shape on the inside. The lip on this one felt a bit cumbersome, hence the turning of it, which I don't always do. I then flatten this top portion of the bowl, turning it straight and removing the very subtle curve it has. This isn't something I'd be able to do if I threw the bowl really thinly to begin with. Equally, if I tried to do this when the clay was still very soft, I would simply end up pressing the clay in, distorting the interior curved shape. With the top part done, the bowl can be sliced off the wheel, flipped over onto a wheel that's been scraped clean. This way nothing embeds itself into the lip of the pot. The piece is then tap centered, and had I made that new chuck you may have seen in a recent video, I would have used that. I'll leave a link to that video on screen now and in the description below. I place a spinner on top of this, which is a tool I can press down through, distributing the pressure across the entire base of the piece to keep the pot pinned down. The black portion of the tool stays stationary, whilst the white part spins, which is a great thing when working with grogged clay bodies, as the rugged clay doesn't rub your fingertips raw. There was some light chattering on this lower section I had to remove, but after refining that, the bowl is attached down in place with 3 lumps of clay. The spinner can be taken off, and now I can trim the rest of the bowl. Before I do that, I set a pair of calipers to 5.5 centimeters across, and I'll use this tool to scratch this measurement into the bottoms of each of these bowls. This way the width of all their feet are the same. I begin by turning the next plane, and I roughly separate this lower half into the 2 distinct angles I'm going to want, the vertical foot portion and another section that will be about 45 degrees or so, linking the foot to the straight part near the rim. This is a process I do somewhat slowly, or rather, I don't try and do this all in one motion, carving away a ton of material at once. Rather, I take it relatively slowly, removing it layer by layer until the shape is right. You'll find that if you're too aggressive with your turning tool and you dig it in harshly to remove a ton of clay, that's often when things go wrong, such as the tool catching suddenly and ripping the bowl off centre. There was, I think, a small bit of plaster in the wall here, which I dug out, filled with more clay and then turned back over. This must have come from the plaster bat this clay was recycled on, and it has to be removed, as otherwise it can do something called lime popping, which, as the pot is fired, would cause the area of clay or glaze surrounding the piece of plaster to fragment away, leaving a small crater. I know what you're thinking. Couldn't there be more plaster inside? And the short answer is yes, but generally speaking I have such a minor issue with lime popping, probably 1 out of every 500 is affected, so hopefully we'll get away with it. With the walls and the side of the foot trimmed, I can begin hollowing out this thick mass of clay on the bottom of this bowl. I begin by trimming a small beveled edge, and then work can start on removing what's inside. And to do this I hold the tool very tightly with a fist grip, and trim with this really fine steel blade that's plunged vertically into the clay. Due to the angle of the blade my tungsten carbide tools have, trimming like this with those is practically impossible, which means it's going to be a very sad day when this specific tool snaps, which it will, as the steel is slowly worn away by the grog in the clay body. So if you are watching and you happen to have this exact same trimmer, if you fancy a trade for a nice pot, do get in touch. And just like trimming the outside, when turning the inside, I do so layer by layer, trimming from the centre to the outside, being very careful not to let the top portion of the blade catch on parts of the foot above it. I think this is perhaps the hardest part of turning these, and I'm sorry for making it look perhaps a bit easier than it really is. What I'm looking for when turning bowls is for the depth of the foot to match the depth of the wall outside of the foot ring. If there's a disparity between them, say the wall on the outside is higher than the floor of the footwell, then that usually means I can remove a bit more material from the outside until they match. This is provided your interior shape is even and consistent. In fact, in many ways, the thrown interior shape is probably the most important thing when it comes to turning. I need to throw that shape consistently over and over again, as it means I can trim each pot the same. Whereas if I accidentally throw the shape of one of the bowls to be slightly deeper than the others, this means I won't be able to trim the foot deep enough in comparison to the others, and it's usually when I do that I do trim holes in the bottoms of my pots. The last step is to burnish the foot and stamp it with my maker's mark, whereupon it can be taken off the wheel, the foot carefully handled as not to distort it, which can happen if you squeeze too hard. And now I can insert the bronze I was speaking about at the beginning. I start by laying a guide across the top, a chopstick in this instance, as it's soft, light and rounded, so it shouldn't damage the rim at all. I then use a potter's needle to create 2 small marks, one on the inside of the rim and one on the outside. I'll try my best to insert the bronze into these pinpricks, but it doesn't matter if it's not completely accurate, as these fragments of metal will bloom where they're put, creating much larger marks compared to their size. I lick my fingertip and then delicately place a piece of bronze onto it, upright. I then lightly press this into the wall of the pot, aiming first to simply tack it onto the surface, and thereafter I use a flat metal edge to fully press it in. It doesn't matter if it leaves a slightly raised bump, it's going to melt anyway, and the glaze I'll cover the pot in will coat it easily. To do the outside, it's easier to insert it if the bowl is flipped over, so again I secure a tiny bit of bronze onto my fingertip, press it in, and then make it flush using the metal tool. That's all there is to it, really, and I'll use this time to quickly say that if you plan on doing this yourself and you don't have access to a gas kiln, your results will be very different from mine. The bronze and copper therein in this instance only turns red as I'm reduction firing using a gas kiln. With an electric kiln in oxidation, you'll get still relatively dramatic marks, but they'll be green, and they won't blossom quite so much as it does when fired in a reduction atmosphere. So just bear that in mind before you do this experiment yourself. Despite placing these fragments of bronze more purposefully, the way they melt is still always a bit random. Sometimes they create these really dramatic metallic dots with these crimson halos around them, whereas other times they're more soft, like a little blush of red. And it's for that reason that I'll cover these bowls with a green glaze, as it will contrast the red really nicely. And with that, that's all of these bowls trimmed, all finished with bits of bronze inserted into them. Thanks again to Alex for sending me all of this. Given how much I've got and the new direction I'm going with using it, this should be enough to last for a couple of years. The next thing I'll do with these bowls is dry them really slowly to bone dry. Once they've turned bone dry, they can be placed into my electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. And for this firing, as the clay won't get hot enough to stick, the pieces can be stacked and piled up as densely as possible, which I do to make each firing as cost effective as it can be. This first firing chemically changes clay into ceramic, partly fusing the particles that make up these pieces. And it's for this reason that the pots will no longer disintegrate if placed in water, as they will sort of become linked. Yet, as the clay isn't fully vitrified, it means there are still channels within the body that water can be absorbed into, which is why after each piece has been biscuit fired, I coat the foot in a thin layer of wax. This way the stoneware here won't be able to absorb water, and therefore the raw materials that make up the glaze won't be able to stick to it, which is a good thing, as I don't want glaze coating this very bottom portion of the pot, as it's this part that will make contact with the kiln shelf during the firing, and if it was coated in glaze then it would stick and fuse to it, resulting in the pot having to be cracked off the shelf, a process that will definitely destroy the pot, but it could also damage the kiln shelf itself, which is a far more precious piece of equipment. At this point I sort of lost the bowls within all the others, but they should be fairly easy to identify, as the bronze creates these small black dots on the pots at this stage. I then dipped each of these pieces into a pale green feldspathic crackle glaze, submerging it for about 3 or 4 seconds before drawing it out, flipping it the right way up and catching glaze on the inside, which I can then swirl about into an even layer. You can hear me blowing on the pot, and I do this to pop any bubbles that come to the surface, as if I do this now they often pop and heal over, creating a flush surface, whereas if I don't get rid of them at this point, they just create these tiny craters which I'm going to have to tidy up later. To get rid of any glaze that settles on the foot, as there's always some that sticks to the wax, I place the bowl up and down on the workbench, like so, the excess glaze coming off in a ring on the wood, which, by the way, I wiped clean prior to this. This way, afterwards, I can just scrape up all this glaze and recycle it. I try to save glaze at every opportunity I can get, as even though I mix it all up in-house, it isn't the cheapest stuff, and if I'm continually doing this for thousands of pots made over the years, I will actually end up saving rather a lot of material, and eventually all the glaze that's collected is sieved back into the larger bucket I initially dipped these into. The next step is to tidy up the surface of these. I begin by gently rubbing over the tongue marks, grinding back the excess glaze that tends to pile around the metal prongs into a flush, smooth layer. It's also at this stage that I rub over any thick drops on the surface, whilst simultaneously being very careful not to make any thin spots, as those will show once the pot has been fired. And once again I'm working over a basin of water, as this will collect much of the glaze dust, which I can then of course recycle. I use a small knife to carve around the foot, scraping away any droplets that have held onto the waxy surface. and then I use a small sponge which I soak in water and carefully fettle all the way around the edge, both inside and out. It's this that gives me the really crisp finish. As without doing this, the glazed line on the bottoms of pots can settle into a rather ragged line after they've been dipped, depending on the type of glaze you're using of course. But this final bit of fettling is my last chance at making the line where glaze and clay meet as pristine and neat as possible. It is often quite slow and arduous work, painful too, especially for my left hand that's actually holding the pot, as I need to grip them in such a way that I don't rub the surface, as the layer of glaze that coats them is really delicate and powdery and is chipped and damaged easily. I'm never just holding the pot without thinking. In fact, the way I handle the pot with my left hand is arguably the most difficult part of this process, and with all of these bowls now glazed and tidied up, once I've accumulated enough work, it can all be packed into my Rohde KG-340 gas kiln. This is a front-loading kiln that's fueled with mains gas, and the firing typically takes about 8 hours from beginning to end. Unlike the firing you saw me pack earlier, when loading the pots inside here, they can't touch, otherwise the glaze coating the pots melts and sticks together, fusing them. With that said, I still try and pack the kiln as tightly as I can, as the more pots I can fit inside, again, the more cost effective each firing becomes. It also makes the reduction firing itself easier. As the pots occupy more space inside the kiln, it means there's less space for oxygen to be present, and during the firing itself, at 860 degrees precisely, I purposefully set the kiln into a state called reduction. This is when you partly starve the kiln of oxygen by increasing the amount of fuel inside the chamber and throttling how quickly it can escape. The gas begins to burn inefficiently as there's not enough oxygen, and as a result, oxygen is stripped away from the clay and glazes, the iron itself changing. And it's this that creates the particular green colour this glaze will ultimately have. If instead I fired the same pot in an oxidised atmosphere, in an electric kiln, the green colour would instead turn yellow. And the surface of the pots would also have less interest overall, because as the oxygen is stripped away from the clay and glazes, it also brings some of the iron with it, which bubbles to the surface and melts into these lovely metallic dots. Every 30 minutes I check the kiln and gradually increase the temperature. Unlike my electric kiln, this one is fired completely by hand, controlled by dampers that cover the flue and all the valves down here. You know a strong reduction atmosphere is happening inside when these plumes of flame start to emanate from the flues in the back of the kiln. And once the correct temperature has been reached and cone 10 is fully bent over, the gas can be switched off, the firing now complete. The colour of the copper red glaze comes out as the kiln cools, which I'll let slowly happen over the course of 2 days. At which point, the pots can be taken out, and here's the first of one of those bowls, although shot inside the kiln where the light really isn't great. Don't worry, there are some much better photographs of these coming up. The next thing I have to do is grind the bottom of each, as during the firing the clay body shrinks around the coarse particles of grog contained, and so these sharp specks need to be softened, which I do with some wet diamond pads made by Diamond Core Tools. 5 of the 6 made it, as sadly the glaze on the foot on one of them crawled a bit, meaning the glaze separated from itself, leaving a bare patch of stoneware on what should be a completely uniform surface. My fault, I think, for glazing the foot slightly too thickly. My first impressions, though, are that these are a success. They feel far more purposeful in their placement. Here are some close-ups of those dots, to show you just how different they can be from each other, from how the metallic dot forms in the centre, to how varied the ring of crimson can be. Sometimes they really fade into the green, like this one, and there are other times where they're intense, like so, which I think I much prefer, although I'm still not entirely sure on the exact reasoning. As a group, it makes stacking them and assembling them together all the more enjoyable, together with introducing some sort of sculptural element when piling them all up or placing them in a row. Due to all the blue test tiles you might have seen, which I fired alongside these bowls, one of them had this lovely red flash on one side, caused by copper carbonate, one of the recipes included. Although unusually, this was the only bowl affected, despite there being a number of tiles in the kiln with copper in them. But it's got me thinking maybe I could place small copper glazed objects around the firing to purposefully create really subtle red blushes like this. It's helped me look at my functional wear a bit differently as a whole, as there are ways to potentially elevate it and to create groups within the larger bodies of work. In some ways, the blossoms of metal have always been a big part of my work, so if there is a way to make them more prominent and more of an intentional feature, I feel like that's a good thing, although it does partly take away the joy of them being random, these beauty spots that would occasionally grace the pots made. But ultimately I think I'm in favour of the option that provides me with more freedom and more creativity, which is implanting them myself. It's this stacking of them that's really interesting. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that stacking up and piling my work is a big part of how I display it, and these just add to that. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the conclusion to this short little experiment. I always love making videos like this that show a new material being used in a novel way. So if you ever happen to have an idea of new materials I could test out, my ears are always open, and it's always fascinating to see what's suggested. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and as always, I'll see you next time.